So this section right here is called X-ray tube failure. Let's see what happens over time. One thing that this used to be an X-ray tube, and a previous student of mine dropped it and broke it. But I was really bummed when it happened because it was a great X-ray tube, and it showed vaporized tungsten on the glass, and it was really just a cool piece to show you guys. But it is now broken, and it's just an anode now. But the X-ray tubes will fail over time. The one that I had, this one that anode came from, was a failed X-ray tube because it had tungsten gas, tungsten being vaporized turned into a gas, and when it cooled back down, it solidified on the glass of the tube, now making for problems. And we're going to see these problems here. Okay, one of these problems is called electrical arcing. You may know that electricity likes to take the path of least resistance. Okay, if you were to deposit enough tungsten, vaporize the tungsten from the disk over long time using the equipment, and now it deposits onto the glass. If you deposit enough tungsten onto the glass, inside of the glass envelope, the electricity might find it easier to jump to the tungsten rather than jump towards the anode. Okay, when that happens, we call that arcing. In fact, the electricity jumping from cathode to anode itself is a form of arcing, but if it jumps from cathode to the glass wall where the tungsten has been deposited, that is also a form of arcing. As the tube ages, tungsten from both the filament and the anode vaporizes and deposits on the window below the anode and cathode. Now this makes for two problems. One of them is electrical arcing. So I'm going to read that first. Eventually, the electricity from the filament can arc down to the tungsten, cracking the glass and causing the tube to lose its vacuum. Before that happens, the tungsten will begin to build up on the glass tube and increase the filtration of the X-ray beam. Okay? As I said earlier, anything that gets in the way of the X-ray beam that's produced will filter it, will block some of it. Okay, and tungsten, as you've learned today, is a very dense material. And that dense material can block the X-ray beam and stop some of it from getting out of the X-ray tube. Now this makes for a problem. This makes whatever gets through the tungsten is now going to be a stronger stuff. It's kind of like when you go outside on a overcast day and you're like, I'm not going to get sunburned because it's an overcast day, I can't see the sun, but you come back with a sunburn, right? You come back with a sunburn because only the strong stuff made it through. All the visible light was blocked by the clouds, right? Where the ultraviolet light was able to scoot right on through those clouds. That can't see it, right? But the ultraviolet light was able to scoot right on through. So as a percentage of the total amount of light that you were exposed to that day, you got more ultraviolet, okay? This effect is called beam hardening. It makes the beam stronger, okay? Just like the sun was stronger on that overcast day, the tungsten is like those clouds. Okay, the tungsten getting in the way is like adding extra clouds. Okay, you now will add infiltration to the beam. Hardening the beam is the term, and now that makes for also unreliable X-ray technique. The X-ray tube will tend to, the term is to shoot hotter. It's kind of a offhanded term. It's not a technical term. It means to shoot hotter, meaning every setting you make is now going to give higher exposure than it otherwise would have. So that's the one problem, increasing inherent filtration. Eventually the electricity will arc. When that happens, it'll crack the tube. Vacuum gets lost. Electrical arcing is the most common cause of X-ray tube failure. You know, the bearings can last for a long time, even if they're getting kind of worn out and making lots of noise. But once the electricity arcs to the tungsten on the wall of the glass, the tube will crack and then the whole thing's over. Some tubes use a metal envelope. Actually, I don't have one of these. I've never cracked open one to see them, but some use a metal envelope instead of a glass. All the ones I've seen are glass. But the nice thing about it is that the metal can, you can run a current through the metal, the glass, so instead of glass, metal, and you can run a current through it and prevent this arcing from happening because the electron beam will be repelled from the metal walls of the tube. So even if you get, tungsten's a metal, so even if you get tungsten now depositing on the wall of the tube, it'll increase the inherent filtration, beam hardening as we talked about, but now the effect of arcing can be mitigated by running current through the metal, which also runs through the tungsten. So that's nice. That's a big problem, electrical arcing, but it only is a problem as the tubes get to very old age. 25, 30 years after they've been, used daily. Heat damage is another issue. Again, excessive rotoring can produce heat damage. Making higher energy exposures than otherwise is necessary adds to the risk of heat damage, but it's just an effect of excessive accumulated heat causing warping of the ball bearings. The ball bearings are nice, spheres. If they warp at all in shape, it's a warping of the bearing, and that makes for a wobbling effect of the anode. And now that wobbling is going to cause more warping of the bearings. And this is sort of a feedback effect, right? The bearings warp, the anode wobbles more, the bearings warp some more, and back and forth until the thing fails. You also get from heat, and you saw this. Did anybody run their fingers across this? You get etching. That the anode track is not. It should be nice and smooth. This whole thing should be smooth. And on top of it being cracked, you can notice that the anode track is really pitted. There's a bunch of tiny little, like almost microscopic little pinholes in it. Okay, that's areas where the tungsten was vaporized off of it. Okay, that etching or pitting on the focal track is a form of heat damage, but its effect is to destroy image quality. Over time, excessive heat conducted down the anode stem to the ball bearings warps them out of round, causes imbalance. We talked about the wobbling effect. This wobbling effect, on top of being like a feedback, like as the anode wobbles, makes the bearings warp more, which makes the anode wobble more, which makes the bearings warp more. On top of that, the wobbling of the anode, right? The focal spot is on the anode, right? And the anode can spin, but the focal spot's still in the same spot. But if the anode moves around like that, that effectively makes for a larger focal spot, okay? Or even worse, a moving focal spot. This, and they say the wobbling of the anode results in an erratic focal spot, effectively increasing the size, destroying image sharpness. So you'll see an obvious decline in images as that begins to happen. This picture shows what I showed you on our anode, right? Over time, the cumulative effects of heat shock cause fine cracks, etching to form along the focal track. This destroys image sharpness. And you'll just notice, your machine's 30 or something years old, you're going to start to notice that, image quality is not as good as it used to be. This is a very slow effect, so it's kind of hard to see. You really only notice the effect once it becomes big enough for your eye to pick up, and then you're like, oh, something's wrong now, right? When equipment's not producing good images, and then you try to find the problem, and if you rule out all the problems on the digital side, right, then you go back, well, the problem's got to be on the equipment side. So then you have someone come and inspect it, and we notice that it's damaged. If the anode fails to rotate because of excessive resistance to rotation, because of warping of the ball bearings, this can cause excessive, and you can kind of see it here, excessive little melting spots. They pointed an arrow toward one of them, where the anode either rotated too slowly or failed to rotate, and now that electron beam just bombards that one area, right? And without the anode rotating and clearing out that area and giving you a nice new area to strike, and that's again damaging. And you see that again on this one here. This also destroys image sharpness. None of these are going to be good for the image. These are all going to damage the image. The next one you should be kind of familiar with, because you probably have all had an incandescent light bulb go out on you sometime in your life, okay? Light bulb goes out, you unscrew it, shake it, and you can hear the filament rattling around inside of it, okay? The filaments break over time. The metals just get weaker and weaker every time current runs through them because they thin out. This is partially due to the vaporizing of some of the metal as it heats up over time. And the same thing happens to our tungsten filaments inside of the cathode. The filament can simply burn out due to constant thinning from vaporization, eventually breaking. Here's the other problem. In the meantime, before it breaks, as the filament thins over time, what do you guys know about the relationship between the thickness of the conductor and the resistance in the conductor? Like, as a conductor becomes thinner, does the resistance go up or down? Up, right? More resistance through a thinner wire than through a fatter wire, right? Well, as these filaments thin, they get thinner, right? And the resistance goes up. Okay. This increases, now the resistance goes higher. This increases effectively the amperage, the MA. It gives you a higher MA number, which means more electrons, which means whatever setting you made, 50 MA, 100 MA, you're now getting effectively more than that. Okay, because of the increases in resistance. And this is just Ohm's law. This is voltage equals amperage times resistance. Okay. And so you end up getting effectively more MA over time and more exposure. So the X-ray tube, on top of other things, will begin to shoot hotter. Okay, this is separate from the shooting hotter caused by the filtering of the tungsten on the glass, the vaporized tungsten. This is the filament now producing more electrons than it used to. So the filament gets stronger over time, and then it just fails. X-ray tubes shoot hotter with age. They produce more for the technique that you're setting as they get older.